Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. David, I was just standing backstage with you thinking, we met in Sweden.
Yeah.
Not that long ago.
Yeah.
Feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah, just before October the 7th, 2023.
I think it was October 4th when we met, and then my husband and I flew home on October 8th.
Okay.
But we had ordered Jews Don't Count. It was waiting for us when we arrived back home. And reading the book and watching this film, which I've done multiple times with both, I find to be such an incredibly stirring, clarifying, intense experience. I wanted to begin by asking you to talk a little bit about your trajectory. I mean, in the UK, you are walk down the street famous. People stop you on street corners, and you know you're David. You're that Jewish comedian.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that because I get mistaken for every other Jewish comedian. It's true. It's true. It's amazing. I mean, none of you will know who this is, but a man, a very famous pop star in Britain, once thanked me for writing Blackadder, which is written by a guy called Ben Elton, who looks a bit like me, and that would be kind of intensely racist. But it happens to me all the time. It's a really extraordinary thing. With a baseball cap on, people think I'm Steven Spielberg. Basically, it's really extraordinary. But my trajectory is, so I'm a stand-up, I still am a stand-up comedian. I still do stand-up. But I started diversifying, I guess, round about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. I was writing novels, I was writing screenplays, still often comic ones, but with an element of more seriousness to them. And then I started doing some quite serious documentaries. I did a documentary about my dad, who had a type of very difficult dementia. I did a few others. And then I was asked by the Times Literary Supplement to write an essay book. And this was meant to be, George Orwell wrote these kind of short, punchy political pamphlets, essentially. And they wanted to revive that tradition in Britain, the Times Literary Supplement. So they said to me, we'd like you to write one, and you can write about anything you like. And kind of without blinking, I said, I want to write about the fact that the people who are supposed to be most concerned about discrimination of all forms don't care about anti-Semitism. That is something they don't care about. And these are people who their very identity is that we are people who care about that. We are the people on the right side of history. We are the people who safeguard the world and monitor the world from the evils of racism and all forms of discrimination. They don't care about Jews. And why not? And so I wrote Jews Don't Count. And some people don't understand that phrase. And in fact, in Germany, this was an interesting thing. Sorry, I'll stop talking in a minute so you can ask another question. But in Germany, the book came out, and initially, I got this note from the German publisher saying, we can't call it Jews Don't Count in Germany because of our history. And I felt like trolling him and saying, sorry, what history? But I didn't do that, and in the end they call it they called it und die Juden, question mark, which means and the Jews, question mark, which sounds creepier to me and weirder. It's like more like a thing a Nazi would say than Jews Don't Count. Because people were worried about, like, can I read this on the subway? You know, in case someone in Germany takes it literally or whatever. And what I'm doing, of course, is modeling an attitude. The title is ironic. The title, in a way, should be Jews Should Count. Jews must count. But they don't seem to. They don't seem to specifically to progressives for whom minorities of other sorts seem to be very important. And so that's what I decided I wanted to write about, yeah.
Today, in preparing for our conversation tonight, I was rereading Jews Don't Count, right here. And I kept on kind of going like this and reading it sort of like it was, you know, like a pornographic magazine that I wasn't supposed to be looking at.
Okay.
Because I had that feeling of, I'm going to be misunderstood reading this.
Were you reading it in public?
In public.
Oh, okay, right.
Oh,
right.
certainly not.
All right.
No.
Yeah. Sorry,
Yeah.
I misunderstood the
No,
pornographic magazine analogy for a moment there.
It was not the right analogy.
Right.
But it was a feeling of if somebody sees this and sees me reading this, they potentially are going to misunderstand.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think, like, at the moment, one of the key things, obviously, about this film and the book is they both came out before October the 7th. And there seems to be, obviously, an enormously heightened, many things are heightened, but self-consciousness, an awkwardness almost around the issue of talking about anti-Semitism, and something that I think the book is very much trying to speak against, which is Jewish shame. And I think a lot of Jews have a very strong internalized sense of shame, which is imposed on them by the culture. And that is primarily about this notion that Jews are powerful and the Jews have no right at some level to speak about vulnerability, to speak about discrimination because they are too powerful, despite 2,000 years, in fact more than 2,000 years of persecution and destruction and racism, that somehow or other that more and more and more there is this sense of being able to speak about that, being able to call out anti-Semitism is harder and harder to do. I mean, with this book, one of the things that I got was an awful lot of people writing to me, either very, much older people who had Holocaust surviving parents, or young people who are essentially young, woke Jewish students who are in rooms with other people fighting the good fight against discrimination, against racism or whatever, and they'd be in those rooms in universities. This is before October the 7th, it's much worse now, but they'd be in those rooms and someone would say something anti-Semitic. And these young people would be writing to me and saying, I am too embarrassed to call that out. That somehow or other I feel that if I were to call that out, it would not be considered legitimate, that I might be laughed at, that no one would think this was like the other forms of discrimination we've been talking about. And I'm proud of this, those young people would read the book and they would say, oh, this gives me a way of talking about it. Because the book is written in the same language. It's almost a banal thing, but it's written in the same language that progressives talk about all the other stuff. It uses phrases like unconscious bias, right? It talks about privilege. It talks about whiteness. And it applies it to Jews. And that seems like a shock at some level for people. But it shouldn't be a shock because there is this enormous history of Jews suffering from the effects of those assumptions.
It seems so incredibly obvious, and yet it's been so buried, and now it's so poignant at the end of the film, that moment where I think it's you who says, things are getting better.
Okay, so I was in the control room watching it, and I just said, yeah, that was wrong. So really, that was wrong. I mean, to some extent, when you do a documentary about a difficult subject, they want you to do an upbeat ending, and no one wants to see a film where it just says, this is really getting bad. But obviously, that is what has happened. And I guess, so another thing people have said to me is, oh, you should do another film, you should write another book, and maybe I will. But one thing I would say is that everything I say in this film and everything I say in this book, I think is on a continuum with what has happened since. And this is not really about the geopolitics of the Middle East, right? That is intractable. That is impossible, I think, and nothing I can say is ever going to fix that situation. What I'm interested in is how Jews are impacted by a rise in anti-Semitism for whatever reason. And what is happening at the moment is that the notion of Jewish power, the notion of Jewish privilege has gone through the roof. That's really what's gone through the roof, right? It's not so much about the Middle East. It's this notion that Jews everywhere are capable of controlling the discourse, that any other voice is suppressed, and it's Jews who are able to say, exactly what they want to. Like, for example, here in this country, soon after October the 7th, Susan Sarandon, who is a very progressive person, right? So let's not hiss, it's not a pantomime. Right? Susan Sarandon said that, I'm sure you know this, said that that Jews who are anxious about the rise in anti-Semitism at the moment, they are getting a taste of what it's like to live in fear, for what Muslims have had to suffer.
Because we didn't know what that was like.
We didn't know what it's like. Obviously, Jews have never known what it's like to live in fear in America in America, where in 2018, 11 Jews were murdered in cold blood in Pittsburgh, and the police said it was not an anti-Semitic incident. I mean, fuck that, basically. That is just incredible, right? And so the intensification, I think, is all on the lines. That's why I don't feel, I mean, you know, maybe I will do it, but I don't feel an incredible need to write Jews still don't count, because it's all, it's just all there already. It's just intensified. And that, by the way, I can't stress enough, this is not anything to do with what is actually happening 4,000 miles away. That is a whole other issue, and I feel that is not the issue I'm talking about.
Yeah, I understand that perfectly. And one of the things that I think has happened since October 7th in this period of time that we've been living through is that the shame that you were talking about,
yeah,
and the silence that is the very close cousin of that shame, has been so pervasive. So, for example, someone like me who is known as a Jewish writer has felt very much, I mean, when you asked me to do this, I was like, I guess I'm coming out.
Right.
I guess I'm coming out, because on social media, I have been very careful, and no matter how careful I've been, it has not been careful enough.
Right.
So when I posted something that felt unimpeachable shortly after October 7th, which basically decried and mourned the loss of all life,
yeah,
that was unacceptable.
right.
Some lives were okay to be lost and others were not.
Yeah.
And I got the first kind of wave of hate mail that I had
Yeah.
gotten about that. You're very used to that.
I am,
But
yeah.
you said in a footnote in the book, having made being Jewish part of your public identity.
Yeah.
You know, that's something, would you say that's something that was always the case for you?
Yeah. So one of the things about me is that I have a slightly neuroatypical thing of needing to talk about myself all the fucking time. And I mean, that might just be a Jewish thing, but it means that I was never able to hide that fact. It always struck me as an odd idea.
Yeah.
To hide it. And so I was doing, I mean, it's interesting because as a comedian, I started to re-examine some of the stuff I was talking about. So, for example, I remember writing this joke, which I'm going to do now, but it's not a joke that I would actually come up with anymore. It's quite a good joke, about how a friend of mine was Jewish and Buddhist, became a Buddhist in later life. So they were a Jewish Buddhist. Hello? That's fine, that's fine. I mean, that could be someone calling about the joke. A Jewish Buddhist, which is someone who believes you to renounce all your material possessions but still keep the receipts. You see, it gets a big laugh, but I wouldn't do that joke anymore, because I think a lot about, like, okay, I'm only prepared to do jokes that don't reinforce like anti-Semitic stereotypes, right? So, for example, I was actually on a BBC radio show. This is another good example of Jews not counting. I was on a BBC radio show, and we were talking about comedy. And suddenly, because I am Jewish and they know this is known about me, they asked all three of us, two of whom were not Jewish, talking, to tell a Jewish joke. And the other two people just told jokes about Jews and money. Just straight away. So and it was kind of an epiphany, to use a Christian word for me. And I thought, I'm not doing that. I know jokes like that, but I'm not going to do it. So I told this joke, which is also, by the way, reinforces another stereotype. But I'll just tell you the joke. It's a hot day, and an Englishman, a Frenchman, and a Jew are sitting on a park bench. And the Englishman says, "I'm so tired and thirsty, I must have beer." And the Frenchman says, "I'm so tired and thirsty, I must have wine." And the Jew says, "I'm so tired and thirsty, I must have diabetes." And the key thing about that is it's funny, and it does reinforce a stereotype, but it's not a malign stereotype. It's not a stereotype like the money thing is, which leads to Jewish houses being burnt down. And all I'm talking about here is having a greater awareness, which is what, by the way, most of the great corrections that we're seeing in terms of racial understanding and in terms of the understanding of minorities in general, it's just having a higher awareness about the subconscious implications about everything that we talk about. But again, that's been missed out, as far as I can see, towards Jews.
So let's talk a little bit about and this is both in the film and in the book and everywhere in our lives these days, this whole, the language of microaggression, which just feels like it's more present now than it was even when you made the film and you wrote the book.
Yeah.
And what constitutes an actual macroaggression? Because, you know, we just saw in your film the investigators after the that whole dreadful scene in Texas and the hostage takers conversation with Rabbi Baddiel, them saying this isn't anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
What does it take for? I mean, I think everyone who's Jewish watching this film would experience, as I certainly have, like a flip book of all of the microaggressions and macroaggressions, if there have been macroaggressions, over the course of a lifetime.
Yeah.
And yet, at the same time, the not being comfortable or feeling safe or feeling like it's appropriate or okay to call it out.
Well, one of the things about microaggressions or macroaggressions, I mean, that distinction is kind of irrelevant, but towards Jews, is that quite a lot of the time they are portrayed as compliments. And this is to do with Jewish power again. So, for example, and I talk about this in the book, but I don't mention this one, is that a friend of mine who's Jewish was looking at a house in London, and it wasn't even that expensive a house, but the estate agent said, oh, I couldn't buy a house like this, I'm not Jewish enough, right? And of course, what that is about, but if you challenge that guy, as this happens quite a lot, he would probably say, sorry, I thought that was a compliment, because it's a good thing, isn't it, to say that Jews are rich? And of course, it's not a good thing, because we don't mean, really, that in a complimentary way. We live in a capitalist culture, yes, but we live in a culture in which most of the time, the politics of envy create a notion that rich people are invulnerable and to be attacked. And also, more importantly, we create an idea with Jews that money is somehow got in an ill-gotten way. This is many, many centuries of this, that Jews are not just rich, but miserly. That Jews have created this money through their secret networks and through their various bad, creations that have led to them being more rich than other people. And also, by the way, and this is something in the book, I think I managed to maintain quite a sort of ironic tone, and there's one bit where I lose it. And the bit where I lose it is when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about a constant beating drum about money, about Jews and money and Jews and money. There's a piece I'm talking about in The Guardian, which is the most sort of progressive paper in Britain, in which someone was saying there is no need for the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, because Jews do not suffer from, I think they called it any form of sort of economic, I can't remember what the word was exactly, but basically that Jews are rich enough that they don't have to worry about this. And by the way, there might be some truth in that certain amounts of I don't know, forget what there's truth in. What I wanted to say is this. What I say in the book is fuck off about money. And the reason I say that is that my grandparents, and it's fine to admit this, I think, my grandparents in Germany, they were rich. Right? My grandparents in Germany, Diona, who's sitting here, her great-grandparents, they owned a brick factory in a place called Königsberg. Right? And Königsberg was in eastern Prussia. They had servants, I believe. Someone says they had a Rubens, I don't know. But you know what that meant? That meant that when in 1933 and then in 1935 the Nazis took over, people thought, why have they got this money, these Jews? They shouldn't have this money, which allows for their house to be burnt down and for people to come knocking on the door and take that money away because it is obviously ill-gotten money. So the association of Jews with money that leads to a notion that they are invulnerable, that nothing else matters, that no type of abuse, no form of racism, no form of offense really matters because these are rich people, that leads eventually to the rich people being destroyed because, and it includes, by the way, all the other people who are not rich, but who are associated with the rich people.
Because, it seems, Jews. Because And this is a quote from your book, but being white is not about skin color, but security. It means you are protected because you are part of a majority culture.
Yes.
Right? So that feeling of ill-gotten wealth does not visit itself upon Mayflower descendants, right?
Well, sorry, how do you mean? What do you mean?
What I mean is
Oh,
that
I see. Yes, there are many, many other people. Many other people.
many other.
I think I used the example. So one of the things I think is that is very important for me to say is that all the many forms of discrimination and racism that affect other communities, I'm not trying in any way to play those down. Right? Those are very extreme, and I'm very aware of them. But I'm just saying that there should be a voice for Jews within that. So as it happens, I think I raised the issue that the ethnic religious community with the most millionaires in the world happen to be Hindus. Right, that's just the case. The data shows that the most millionaires in the world happen to be Hindus, right? Now, no one, certainly no progressive person, I hope, but no one, I hope, would say that that means that if you say something horrible or attack a Hindu person, essentially for being a person of color, that that's okay because they are wealthy, right? But that does happen to Jews. I mean, a lot of this is to do with binary thinking. So binary thinking is essentially that the world exists only in terms, and the internet is very responsible for doing this, in terms of the powerful and the powerless, the victimizers and the victimized. And I can't remember if Jonathan Safran Foer actually says this in the documentary or not, but Jonathan Safran Foer said at one point to me that it's very hard for some reason to think of Jews as the victimized, despite many, many years of Jews being victimized. The way I would put it is that the binary is wrong, and Jews are a glitch in the binary, right? Because yes, some Jews are rich, some Jews are powerful, but some Jews are really not, right? And Jews do have a long history of being disempowered. And so this idea that the world is only about the powerful and the powerless, the victimized and the victimized, it's wrong, and it's really wrong in terms of Jews who are constantly in a sort of flux between those two things. And I think progressives find that irritating. I think they do. I think progressives are irritated with Jews because they would rather the world was just, good and evil, and that Jews shouldn't be in this sort of thing whereby, well, we don't know quite where to put Jews because we can't say they're completely vulnerable. We can't patronize them, kind of like we do all other minorities. We can't save Jews. Where are the Jewish saviors, right? We can't do that. So we don't really know what to do with them. And so there's this sense of, sort of, as I say, sort of anger, I think, and frustration with us.
Yeah. And toward the end of your film, Patrick Marber has this fantastic phrase, terrible and chilling, which is that we are an unprotected species.
Yeah. I think that's a really good phrase. Because in a way, the idea of a protected species is humans offer this to the animals, right? And we offer it to the animals because there are certain animals that we think are vulnerable. Now, whether or not this is always a good thing, and there's all sorts of examples, as we know, of white saviourness and whatever, in which, the majority culture thinks, oh, I will take it upon myself to help out other people who are more vulnerable than me. Whether or not that's always a good thing, and it's not always a good thing, but whether or not it is, it comes from an instinct that we, as the people who are privileged, should help out the people who are less privileged. And so let's just say that's a good thing. And yet it seems impossible for those people, the majority culture, to see the possibility that Jews might occupy a less privileged position. And in a very simple thing, I found myself saying this, I was interviewed by someone from the New York Post yesterday, and I found myself saying the most banal thing I've ever said, which was just, I grew up in a lower middle class part of London. I went to a Jewish primary school. I went to a Jewish youth group. All my mum's and dad's friends were Jews. I was in a sort of slight ghetto really there. And not a single Jew was rich or powerful. They just weren't. My brother, your dad, he was a taxi driver here in New York, right? He's Jewish. Like, lots of Jews are not rich and powerful, right? And it's so extraordinary. I quote someone in the book who is one of the most progressive people in the world. He's so progressive. He's for all sorts of campaigns for left-wing people in Britain. I don't give his name, and I'm not going to give it now because he's very well known. And in terms of the campaign that we tried to do about trying to stop people doing anti-Semitic chanting at football. I don't mention this in the film, but there was a whole campaign, a little film that me and my brother made, trying to stop people from using the word yid and yiddo and associated anti-Semitic chants. And by the way, it's much worse than you saw in the film. People hiss to resemble the noise of gas chambers. People do songs about Auschwitz. It's really, really bad. So we did a consciousness-raising film, and it begins with a black footballer saying, people used to shout the N-word at me, they don't do it anymore. Then there's an Indian footballer or a Pakistani footballer who says, people used to say the P word at me, they don't do it anymore. But people, and then another footballer, Gary Lineker, I don't know if you know who that is, a very famous man. Gary Lineker says, but people seem to think it's okay to use this word. And then we hear people shouting the word yid. And this very, very, very progressive person said to me, I watched that film, and I don't understand why you're saying that the Y word is just as bad as the N word or the P word. Why are you saying that? And I said, well, why wouldn't I say it? He said, because Jews are rich. And it's kind of extraordinary that he should just reflexively say that, as if it cancels out all forms of racism. And by the way, intensely patronizing to black and brown people to imagine that they can't be rich.
So social media is like pouring, gasoline on all of this. Because the lack of nuance, which is what you're talking about, this absolute binary way of thinking, is something that has created, at least from my perspective, this huge divide in social media. And where do we go from here?
Well, I think one thing social media has really, really been bad in terms of the binary thinking and the good and bad thinking and the sort of pantomiming of life. And whatever you think about Elon Musk, he has made it worse. And he has made it worse for one specific reason, which is the Overton window, which is a phrase that means the allowable political and social discourse that we all live in. It used to be a certain thing on, say, Twitter. Now it has been smashed. It has been smashed like Kristallnacht. Because literally you open that site now and there are straightforward Nazis talking about Jewish parasites, talking about Jews drinking blood, and they have 2 million followers. It's sort of incredible. I don't hold necessarily with the types of censorship that might have existed on that platform before, but unfortunately what happens with an algorithm that just says we're going to have a total free-for-all is that the fringe sort of elements, or the elements that were fringe, will start to dominate because they allow people to drift towards it in a way that feels that they have a greater voice, a greater sense of outrage, a greater sense of identity, because the more extreme you are, the more your identity is. And all of that is all bad for all minorities, but particularly bad for Jews. One thing I think, well, should we go to questions, or shall I? There's one thing I wanted to say, I guess, which is, so one of the things about, which I think probably you're all, I don't know, you might not be, but it is about, like, have my feelings towards Israel changed since October the 7th? I think that's probably something.
You want to preempt that question?
No, I don't want to preempt it. I'm just, and sorry if anyone wanted to ask that question, but it's on my mind. And here, I don't want to tell you something, I just wanted to explain something that happened. It's sort of more, I don't know if it answers the question, but it's kind of a story. So after October the 7th, I was asked by many, many outlets in Britain to come and talk about it. And in the end, I went on the BBC, and I talked about something which was how my intellectual kind of detachment from Israel, which is very based on a kind of argument. And the argument is, until Phil Wang, who is a British Chinese comedian, until Phil Wang, every time he opens his mouth, is asked how he feels about the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs, until that moment happens, I am not going to speak about Israel. It is not incumbent upon me as a British Jew to have an opinion about a country 4,000 miles away, because it does not happen to other minorities, right? And since October the 7th, I can promise you, while Jewish restaurants are being bombed, while synagogues are being graffitied, while a synagogue in Melbourne is being set on fire, After Ukraine was invaded, no Russian Orthodox church in Britain did that happen to. No Chinese restaurant has been graffitied since they've been putting 1 million Uyghurs in prison. No British Pakistani has ever been asked about how they feel about human rights there, or a British person who might have a heritage in Saudi Arabia. This doesn't happen. It just happens to Jews. And so my position on Israel is very about that. It's very about we have to be a proper minority. As a proper minority, we should refuse to always be incumbent upon us to answer questions about a heritage country. However, I went on TV and I said my intellectual detachment has been overridden at this moment by an emotional sense. And the emotional sense was, I think, very negative. And what I mean by that is, I think October the 7th was a pogrom. It was a pogrom. And I guess I felt something happen there which connected me in a very dark way to the people in Israel that maybe hadn't felt connected before. Like the book, as it happens, hadn't come out in Israel until it came out in November 2023. And I did a big interview in Haaretz. And the journalist, I spoke to him and I said, why hasn't this book come out in Israel yet? Is it because Israelis are pissed off that I talk about not feeling this deep emotional commitment to Israel? And he said, no, we don't care about that. I said, so what is it? He said, it's because in your book, you're trying to establish Jews as a real minority. But in Israel, we're not a minority. We're the majority. And I said, okay, so why has it come out now? Is it because after October the 7th, even though numerically you're a majority, you feel like a minority? And he said, yes. And what I meant by that was maybe October the 7th was the first time that Israelis truly felt like Jews. And that's why I felt connected to them. I felt connected to them because I thought, oh, now it's like the same, unfortunately. It's the same as my history. And I guess that might be wrong, by the way. There might be lots of Israelis who have felt like that before. But I guess I felt connected to them because of my own family history, and that moment is what I think. So it hasn't made that much difference, though, to my basic intellectual position, because my intellectual position is we need to be able to say, we are not collectively responsible for what happens a long way away. Otherwise, we will never be seen as a proper minority. So that remains my position.
Right. Well, again, just perfect clarity.
Thank you.
I think that maybe this is the moment to open it up to questions, because
So can I just say, before we have the questions, there's a bunch of Jews in the room and non-Jews as well, and so they should be allowed to ask questions. So if anyone wants to say something really, really angry, that's fine.
But also, that's not a question.
That lady there. Can you just, we've got a microphone coming.
I just wanted to say, well, first of all, my question is mostly about humor.
Yeah.
And mostly about writing jokes, because I remember you from the Mary Whitehouse experience back in the day.
Yeah, sure.
So, and I didn't even know that you were Jewish.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, a friend of mine from London said, you should go and see David Baddiel in New York. I've been here for a long time. My husband is American. He's actually Jewish, and his history is very similar to yours. Right. To your family. So, my question to you is, I used to think of you as this really funny guy that
now
the nasty no, but you're
just this terribly dry.
So my question to you is, how do you deal with writing jokes in an era that requires you to actually think about other people's feelings?
Yeah, well, that's...
Because in the 90s, it was different.
Okay, well, that's a very big question about comedy, which I don't know I want to answer now exactly. I just write... Actually, well, I can answer it in one way, and I can answer it in terms of Jews. So I personally think there is no subject that you cannot joke about. What you have to look at is the subject matter. It's not the subject matter, but the individual joke. So, for example, people say you can't joke about the Holocaust. That is not true. Let me tell you a Holocaust joke. This is a joke that was told to me by a Jewish academic, called Devorah Baum, a very eminent Jewish academic. And this is the joke. After the war, a Holocaust survivor dies and goes to heaven. When the Holocaust survivor gets to heaven, God asks the survivor to tell him a Holocaust joke. So the survivor does. And God says, that's not funny. And the survivor says, well, I guess you had to be there. I love that joke. I love that joke because, you know, I'm an atheist, but if I believed in God, I might think, well, he wasn't there, was he? He took a leave between 1939 and 1945. And that, I think, says something very profound, but also it is a Holocaust joke, right? But it's not a really horrible joke. It's not about, because I think you can tell jokes about anything, you just have to think, what are the semiotics of this particular joke? Who is it targeting? Who is it making a villain of? What stereotypes are it reinforcing or whatever? And I continue to think that about all sorts of subjects, I think. There's a lady there who got a hand up very quickly.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Yes, hi. I'm a journalist, but I also spent an enormous amount of time in England, and I did my dissertation on British broadcasting. Mary Whitehouse was one of the groups I worked at. The bottom line is I'm here in several rows of journalists. There's me, and there's the guy who left. Doesn't that say something?
I don't know who left. Who left? Who left?
He was here too. He's a podcaster, and I think he spoke to you earlier.
Oh,
But
okay.
the point is...
Did he leave it discussed? I haven't quite understood your point.
My point is there's no journalists here. Why aren't journalists covering this? Why are they not coming and talking about anti-Semitism?
Well, that's because Jews don't count.
That
is why Jews don't count. I mean, I don't want to slag it off, but the only interview I've done was with the New York Post. And I should be being interviewed by the New York Times, not because of me, but because this is a subject that should, I mean, particularly this city, right? But I'll tell you something. Can I tell you something? Which is, I was asked to write an opinion piece when my book first came out for the New York Times, and I wrote it, and it essentially just summarized what you've just seen, and then suddenly they didn't print it. Right? Suddenly they didn't print it, and about 4 months later, I got a message saying that the editor felt it wasn't really the kind of thing we should be covering at the moment. And that's just the way it is. There's this constant silence. Like someone said very brilliantly once, that the issue with my film and my book is it's doing something quite unusual, which is it's describing an absence. It's describing something that isn't there. And by that I mean that I don't think necessarily that the person who made that decision at the New York Times is an anti-Semite, but what they are is someone who thinks, I think I don't want to create trouble, I don't want to publish this right at the moment, I think it's probably considered not as important as something to do with some other minority, so I'll just leave it, I'll just forget about it. And that leads to an absence, that leads to a silence. It is not printed, right? And that's what I'm talking about. It's a sort of forgetfulness around the issue of anti-Semitism. That guy, who looks a bit like Elvis Costello, got his hand up quite quickly.
Hi, David.
Hi.
It's Josh Fox.
Hi.
I've done an event here about my film Gasland.
Right.
I just wanted to mention that it's never, ever brought up that I'm a Jewish filmmaker.
Right.
It's never made a connection between the activist work that I have done that I'm a Jewish filmmaker.
Right.
But my question is, nowadays, you hear this refrain all the time. Anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I happen to believe anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. But regardless of your position on Israel, what definitely is anti-Semitism is when white people, or non-Jewish people of color, tell me what anti-Semitism is.
Yeah, yes. So that's a very key
And so
thing.
I want you to comment on that.
No, that's very correct, Josh. That's very correct. So one of the things I'm trying to do, that's not in the film, but it is in the book, is turn the tenets of progressivism on progressives and say, why does this not apply to Jews? So one of the key tenets of progressive thinking is that it is up to the minority to define what the racism or discrimination, by the way, because it's not just ethnic discrimination. This applies to, LGBTQ people or autistic people or whatever, that it is up to the minority to define what constitutes discrimination against them, except for Jews, whereby virtually any non-Jew can tell you that something is or isn't anti-Semitism. And that happens all the time and is really a very, very basic building block of the Jews don't count mentality. I mean, an interesting thing, actually, is that there have been various investigations into the Labour Party anti-Semitism. That's sort of one of the things that I talk about in the film. The Labour Party in Britain under Jeremy Corbyn was accused of anti-Semitism, and it was a big thing. And then they had investigations into it. And one of the things I noticed was that the people doing the investigation, the people who were heading the inquiry, were not Jewish. Now, there is no way in the world that an inquiry into any other form of racism in Britain at this time would be headed by anyone else than a person of colour. It would be absolutely unthinkable for that to happen. And yet, there is a sense in which if you investigate anti-Semitism, we can't leave it to the Jews. They'll be biased, right? And you kind of think like, fucking hell, it's incredible. Yes, that lady there.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay, so I remember the first time that I really noticed, not social media, it wasn't invented yet, but popular media, news media, the New York Times, lying about Jews, lying about Israel. In fact, I had visited Israel twice by the time I was 18, so I'm talking about like 1998.
Okay.
And ever since then, when they lied about a story involving Jews and Israel, and it's only gotten worse and worse by the year. I think I started noticing in like 2016, 2017.
I'm going to have to ask you what your question is. Sorry.
I'm going to get there really quick.
Okay.
That there's been 200% rise in anti-Semitism in the United States over last year. 300%, 400%, every year. It's hundreds of percent.
Yeah.
And this, I think, correlates with news media spreading disinformation about what's actually going on.
Yeah.
How do you think such a minority of people can combat that kind of disinformation campaign when the number of people spreading these lies vastly outnumber the number of Jews that exist?
Okay, so I'm not going to be that helpful with the answer to this because the film and the book are not pieces of social engineering. So I do not have an answer to this type of anti-Semitism. What I have is an analysis of it. So what the book provides and what the film hopefully provides along with it is a sense of, okay, this is how you can deconstruct what is happening. That's a beginning. After that, how you actually fight against it, I think, as I say, I think what this does is give people a language to talk about it in, and hopefully it gives them a language that is the same language that they might talk about other minorities in. But I think in terms of the numbers, and in terms of the channels, how you do that on social media when it's so full of people who the minute you start talking about anti-Semitism will start, just bombarding you with terrible stuff, I don't know, is the truth. And actually, there's a woman called Anne Applebaum who wrote a brilliant book about autocracy recently. She says in it at one point that the old models, i.e. the old way that the news media was and the old ways that we think about the discourse, has not realized how much people actually desire disinformation. And that is very true, that we live in a world which is storified, i.e. people have beliefs in certain stories, one of which is that the Jews control the world and that the Jews are evil and the Jews are powerful, and they will find information that fits that story even if it is not true, which of course it isn't. So I don't really know how to combat it except by saying this is the way it happens.
One of the things that we all need more of is discourse from many different points of views so that we humanize one another. And you do a great job of doing that and modeling that. So I, first of all, would love to know if you had any suggestions for how to do that outside of listening to a podcast. And second of all, I actually wrote in you got some feedback about interrupting on the podcast.
Right.
And I wanted to ask if you knew about collaborative overlaps, which is a linguistic pattern often associated with Jews, which is a yes and, to say, yes, and I agree, but it's often misunderstood as interrupting.
Okay, wow. So for anyone who doesn't know, I do a podcast which isn't on at the moment, but it was caused quite a lot of noise in Britain. It's called A Muslim and a Jew Go There. I do it with a politician in Britain called Baroness Saida Varsi. She is a conservative politician, but extremely pro-Palestinian. And so the key element of that podcast, which I found very interesting, if very difficult, is that we do not agree at the end of the podcast many times. The point of the podcast is not to resolve. It's to sit in quite uncomfortable disagreement with each other and just hear let each other be heard. And it's an interesting thing because one thing social media has really done that's really bad is it preys on the human desire to win. Every single conversation on social media is someone trying to win something, and that's because it's in public. This is a really bad thing. We were not meant to argue everything in public, and if you do, people feel diminished by losing. And if they feel diminished by losing, they will never listen, right? They will just get angry. So that podcast tries to move against that by just letting ourselves sit in disagreement. I did at one point, you're right, someone wrote in to complain about me interrupting her. I actually tried quite hard not to do that afterwards. She's a fucking politician, so she does speechify at quite great length. That yes and thing, I've never heard of constructive overlap. It's an improvisational thing as far as I'm concerned. It's an collaborative overlap, but yes and is an improvisational thing. It's a thing all the time that I know about through comedy improvisation. So, so I use it with hecklers, for example. I use it with hecklers all the time. I use it with trolls as well. So I remember, someone said to me on Twitter, he called me a stupid, privileged idiot, and he'd spelt privilege with an A. So I said, yes, I'm so privileged I know how to spell it. And then someone else said, telling people off for spelling mistakes is so 2015. I said, you've spelt so wrong. And that is yes and. You see, that's yes and. So that's how I know it. But anyway, I try not to interrupt her too much. We're going to have to stop. Oh, it's very Jewish. Okay, yeah. We have to stop quite soon. This gentleman just put his hand up. Do you want to wait for the mic? People are starting to leave. We have to stop quite soon. They're thinking about eating. I know they're thinking about eating.
One of the many poignant points in your film was when you went on the Jason Lee podcast to kind of apologize, but also you were seeking allyship. Yeah. And you've talked a lot about in this Q&A about how social media is a terrible place, but it's also one of the few places we can extend allyship in this discourse and everything. But then people on social media are branded as Zionist or even if they're not even expressing Zionist values or beliefs. Yeah. So in a world where allyship is challenging, is it still a way of kind of making Jews count in that way? Through social media? Or just seeking allyship. What are the other ways to seek allyship?
I don't really know the answer to that. I think social media is generally, it did obviously create allyship for other minorities. I mean, the book is quite informed and possibly over-triggered by things on social media, I think, now. But, a lot of the big social movements of our time, Me Too and Black Lives Matter, were essentially started on social media. And there's never been an example of a Jewish movement created on social media that's anything like it. I mean, actually, #Jews don't count will trend occasionally in Britain when there's a really obvious example of that. The Royal Court thing actually was that in Britain. But, the idea of an active social movement spilling out from the screen to the streets that is created by social media that is Jewish allyship, that will never happen. Sorry to say it, but it won't. That doesn't mean you can't inform and educate people if you're prepared to put up with the trolls. I want to tell a story to finish with. Is that possible? Yeah. Is that possible? Because I think it's time to stop, and I want to tell a story before we go. Is that all right? Okay. So thank you for all your questions, and can I say thank you very much to Danny Shapiro for hosting this. We've hardly talked about Danny's incredibly interesting backstory involving her own heritage, which is unbelievably interesting. I urge you to read many of her books, but particularly Inheritance, which I'm reading now, which will help you with that. But I'm just going to tell this story, because we talked a lot about Jewish shame. This is a funny story, but also a telling story. So Jewish shame is something which I'm interested in combating, and the most extreme example I ever had of it was in 1999. So I used to do a comedy show about football. You know that from what happened with Jason Lee. And on that comedy show about football, me and the other comedian who's called Frank Skinner were being interviewed outside Wembley Stadium, where all the big football stuff happens, on a Saturday by a man called Jim Rosenthal. And Jim Rosenthal was a football presenter. And in that way that I was talking to David Schwimmer about, when you see someone on the TV and you're a member of a minority and you think, oh, he's Jewish, he's one of me, you get excited about it. And when I was a kid and he was on TV, I was quite excited that Jim Rosenthal was Jewish. So when he's interviewing me in 1999, I'm excited about that on this Saturday, and he's talking to me and Frank, and I just say, as a passing comment, I say, Jim, should you be working on Shabbos, right? And big laugh here, but no laugh there at all. Jim gets very angry and stops the filming and says, I'm not Jewish. I'm not Jewish. I get out of that. He says, I get out of that because of my mum, obviously because of the idea that matrilinear means that you're Jewish or not. But that's not the point. The point is, can you imagine, think about the internalized anti-Semitism there, any other minority in a time of empowerment, in a time of visibility of minorities, a time when minorities have to be seen. Any other minority saying, I'm not that, I don't want to be seen as that, please don't stain me with that, right? So that was really awkward and terrible. The other comedian, Frank Skinner, was quite annoyed because he'd done 4 jokes, he had to do them all again. It was all embarrassing. Then, cut to 2002, and I was in Japan for the Soccer World Cup. And in Japan, as some of you may know, there's often a big spa area at the bottom of your hotel. So I go down, because I like a spa, I go down to the bottom of the hotel, there's a sauna there. I go into the sauna, and there, naked, in the middle of the sauna, is Jim Rosenthal. And you know what? He fucking is Jewish. Thank you very much. Thank you. Do buy the book if you want.